What if I told you one of the greatest prophets in history begged God to kill him, only days after witnessing one of the greatest miracles ever recorded? Think about that. Not after failure, not after defeat, after victory, after fire fell from heaven, after an entire nation watched God answer him publicly. Elijah didn't collapse in the valley. He collapsed on the mountain. And maybe that's exactly why this story matters.
Today, we're not just retelling the story of Elijah. We're uncovering something deeper: how exhaustion, fear, isolation, spiritual pressure, and emotional burnout nearly destroyed one of God's strongest servants. Because beneath the miracle on Mount Carmel, there was a man silently breaking apart. And what happened to Elijah, he still happens to people today. Many people read Elijah's story as a story about power. But it's also a story about mental collapse. A story about what happens when purpose fails, pressure collide. This is where many misunderstand spiritual strength. Powerful people can still become emotionally exhausted. Faithful people can still feel hopeless. Even people used by God can secretly wish they could disappear.
Before Elijah ever broke down, he carried something unbearably heavy. Loneliness. Israel had abandoned God. King Ahab had corrupted the nation. And Queen Jezebel hunted prophets like animals. Imagine standing in a collapsing culture while feeling like the only voice left speaking truth. That was Elijah.
Isolation changes the human mind. When someone feels alone long enough, the nervous system begins treating life like constant danger. And Elijah wasn't just spiritually burdened. He was psychologically exhausted from carrying responsibility without relief. Sometimes the strongest people become depressed because they've spent too long being strong for everyone else.
Then came the moment that should have changed everything. Elijah stood against the prophets of Baal in one of the most dramatic spiritual confrontations in Scripture. One man against hundreds. And when Elijah prayed, fire fell from heaven. The people fell on their faces. Race. The drought ended. Rain returned. By every visible standard, Elijah had won.
But here's the strange reality about human psychology. Massive emotional highs are often followed by devastating emotional crashes, especially after prolonged stress. Athletes experience it. Soldiers experience it. Leaders experience it. And Elijah had been operating under survival-level pressure for years. This is where many misunderstand victory. Sometimes your greatest public triumph happens at the exact moment your inner world is running out of strength.
Then came one sentence, one threat, one message from Jezebel. By this time tomorrow you will be dead. And suddenly, the fearless prophet ran.
This moment confuses many readers. How does a man who just called down fire from heaven become terrified of one woman's threat? But trauma doesn't always operate logically. After prolonged stress, the human brain can shift into survival mode instantly. Fear becomes amplified, hope disappears quickly, small threats feel enormous. Think about this. Elijah may not have been reacting only to Jezebel's words. He may have been reacting to years of accumulated exhaustion finally collapsing all at once. The threat was simply the final crack in an already overwhelmed soul.
Elijah fled into the wilderness. And eventually, he sat beneath a broom tree. Then he prayed one of the darkest prayers in the Bible.
It is enough now, Lord. Take my life.
The prophet who once called down fire now wanted to die.
Notice something important. Elijah didn't lose his gifting. He lost his emotional burnout at its deepest level, when the mind becomes so overwhelmed that even survival feels exhausting. This scene destroys the myth that spiritual people are immune to depression. The Bible does not hide human weakness. It exposes it honestly, and maybe that honesty is part of its power. Now watch carefully, because God's response is shocking. God does not begin with a sermon. He doesn't rebuke Elijah. He doesn't shame him. He doesn't say, "Have more faith." Instead, God lets Elijah sleep, then feeds him. This is one of the most compassionate moments in Scripture. God addressed Elijah's physical exhaustion first, because exhaustion can distort our perception.
Sometimes people don't need condemnation. Sometimes they need rest. Pause here. What if part of Elijah's spiritual crisis was also biological?
Exhaustion. The Bible quietly acknowledges something profound. Human beings are souls, but also bodies. But this is where everything changes. Because Elijah's deepest problem wasn't fear. It wasn't Jezebel. It wasn't even exhaustion. It was perception.
What are you doing here, Elijah? I alone am left.
That sentence reveals the true condition of Elijah's mind. Isolation had distorted his reality. Depression often convinces people nobody understands, nobody cares, nothing will change. And Elijah believed exactly that. They are completely alone. But Elijah was wrong. There were still thousands who had not abandoned God. Depression often speaks in absolutes. Always, never, no one. And those absolutes can feel real, even when they are not true. Then came one of the most mysterious moments in the Bible. A mighty wind passed by, but God was not in the wind. An earthquake came, but God was not in the earthquake. Then fire, but God was not in the fire. And finally, a still small voice. Why does this matter? Elijah expected God to appear dramatically, like on Mount Carmel. But healing did not come through spectacle. It came through a gentle whisper. And sometimes people only recognize God in power, while missing him in peace. Notice something remarkable. God never tells Elijah his feelings aren't real. Instead, he gives him new direction, new assignment, new relationships, including someone Elijah desperately needed, Elisha. Healing often begins when isolation ends. God did not design Elijah to carry everything alone forever. And maybe this is one reason burnout becomes dangerous. We keep trying to survive without connection. Think about this. One of the greatest prophets in history still needed friendship, support. Human companionship is vital. Strength is not the absence of need. It is the courage to embrace it. For centuries, people have celebrated Elijah's fire. But maybe the greater miracle was that God stayed with him in the darkness. Many people believe faith means never struggling emotionally. But Elijah's story says something different. Faith sometimes looks like collapsing under a tree, while God refuses to abandon you there. This is where many misunderstand spiritual maturity. Some people know how to stand boldly before crowds, but have never learned how to survive silence, exhaustion, and despair. Elijah had mastered confrontation, but now he had to learn surrender. Maybe that's why this story still feels painfully modern, because many people today are living exactly like Elijah, performing publicly, breaking privately, winning externally, collapsing internally, smiling in front of people while silently asking God if they can keep going, and yet that's important. The cave was not the end. The exhaustion was not the end. God still had purpose for Elijah, even after Elijah lost sight of himself. And maybe someone listening to this needed to hear that. Not every exhausted season means your story is over. Sometimes, it means you've carried too much for too long. And sometimes the first step toward healing is not pretending to be strong, but finally admitting you're tired. So here's the question. Have you ever had a moment where you felt like Elijah? Where you kept showing strength on the outside, while falling apart internally? If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts below. And remember, the same God who met Elijah in the cave still meets people in quiet places today.